It's a night in Rome, somewhere around 47 or 48 AD. On the Palatine Hill, Emperor Claudius is asleep in the Imperial Palace. Or at least, that's what everyone assumes. But somewhere in the city below, in the narrow streets near the Forum, a woman walks alone through the darkness. She wears a blonde wig hiding her natural hair. She has no more than a maid for escort, and she's heading toward a place no Roman woman of her status should ever go. According to the satirist Juvenal, writing decades later, she enters a brothel that stank of old soiled sheets. She takes off her clothes, takes the name Lupa, she-wolf, and she works. All night. When the brothel keeper finally tries to close, she's the last to leave, her cheeks stained with lamp smoke, as Juvenal describes it, taking back to the imperial pillow all the odours of the whorehouse. This woman, the woman working as a prostitute in a Roman brothel while her husband slept in the palace, was Valeria Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius, mother of Britannicus, heir to the throne, the most powerful woman in the Roman Empire. But here's what makes this story fascinating. According to Pliny the Elder, one of Rome's most respected historians, Messalina didn't just visit a brothel. She competed. She challenged the most notorious professional prostitute in Rome to a contest. 24 hours. And according to Pliny, Messalina won. The score? 25 men to the prostitute's unknown total. Now, you might be thinking, was this real? Did this actually happen? But here's the thing, that's not the right question. The better question is, what did Romans think when they heard this story? Because the answer reveals something profound about Roman civilization itself. Something about power, about gender, about the fine line between spectacle and terror in ancient Rome. Today, we're going to find out what Romans actually thought when their empress became a prostitute. And the answer is far more complicated and far more interesting than you'd expect. To understand what Romans thought of Messalina, we need to understand who she was before she became Rome's most infamous empress. Valeria Messalina was born around 20 AD into one of Rome's oldest and most powerful patrician families. The Valerii were aristocracy, the kind of family that had been important when Rome was still a republic, centuries before emperors existed. Her great-great-grandfather had been consul. Her mother was connected to the imperial family. In Rome, these bloodlines mattered more than almost anything. She married Claudius around 38 AD, when she was probably 18 or 19 years old. At the time, Claudius wasn't emperor yet. He was the family embarrassment, the limping, stuttering scholar that everyone assumed would never amount to anything. But Messalina gave him something crucial: legitimacy. Her patrician blood connected him to Rome's ancient power structures, and more importantly, she gave him children. A daughter, Octavia, and a son, Britannicus, born in 41 AD. That same year, everything changed. Emperor Caligula was assassinated, and the Praetorian Guard, those imperial bodyguards who had just killed one emperor, found Claudius hiding behind a curtain and proclaimed him the new emperor. Suddenly, the family embarrassment was the most powerful man in Rome, and Messalina, at barely 21 years old, was empress. But here's what Romans understood immediately, even if we miss it today. An empress in Rome wasn't just the emperor's wife, she was a political figure. Her body, who she slept with, who she allied with, what children she produced, was a matter of state security. The Senate watched her. The imperial freedmen watched her. Rival families watched her. Everyone was watching. Because in Rome, an empress who made the wrong choice could destroy the empire. And Messalina, according to every source we have, made a lot of wrong choices. Let's start with what the Roman sources actually tell us. Because once you read them, you realize something important. The story of Messalina isn't one story. It's multiple stories, told by different authors for different purposes, sometimes decades apart. The most graphic account comes from Juvenal, in his Satire 6, written sometime between 100 and 128 AD, more than 50 years after Messalina's death. Juvenal was a satirist. His job was to exaggerate, to shock, to entertain. And in Satire 6, he's trying to convince his friend Posthumus not to get married by giving him a catalogue of terrible Roman wives. Messalina is his star exhibit. Here's what Juvenal claims. He says that Messalina would wait until Claudius fell asleep, then slip out of the palace wearing a blonde wig. She'd go to a brothel, take a cubicle hung with a curtain, strip naked, and work as a prostitute under the name Lupa, she-wolf. Juvenal describes her with nipples gilded, serving each comer in turn. He says she wouldn't leave when the brothel keeper tried to close. She'd be the last one there, exhausted by man, but not yet sated. This is the image that's dominated popular culture for 2,000 years. The nymphomaniac Empress, the woman who couldn't control her desires. But here's the crucial detail. Juvenal is writing satire. His audience, educated Romans reading this decades later, understood that satire exaggerates. They weren't reading this as journalism. They were reading it as moral commentary wrapped in shocking entertainment. Then there's Pliny the Elder. Pliny was different. He was an encyclopedist, a natural historian, writing around 77 AD. He was also a contemporary. Born in 23 AD, he was alive during Messalina's life, though probably too young to have known her personally. And in his Natural History, Book 10, Section 83, while discussing human versus animal reproduction, he mentions Messalina almost casually. He's making an argument that humans, unlike animals, don't know sexual satiety, and as evidence he writes, Messalina, the wife of Emperor Claudius, selected for a competition a certain maid who was the most notorious of the professional prostitutes, and beat her in a 24 hours match with a score of 25. 25. That's the number that's echoed through history. 25 men in one competition. Pliny doesn't elaborate. He doesn't moralize. He just states it as a fact in a book about natural history, then moves on. But notice what's missing. The most serious historian of this period, Tacitus, writing in the Annals around 115 to 120 AD, doesn't mention the prostitute story at all, not once. Tacitus gives us the most detailed account of Messalina's political maneuvering, her executions of rivals, her final downfall. But the brothel visits? The competition? Nothing. This absence is crucial. If the prostitute story was common knowledge, if it was as public and scandalous as Juvenal makes it sound, why does Rome's most meticulous historian omit it entirely? Tacitus wasn't shy about recording sexual scandals when he had evidence. He documents Tiberius's alleged perversions in Capri. He describes Nero's excesses in detail. So why silence on Messalina's prostitution? The answer reveals something important about how Roman sources work, and what we can actually know about what Romans thought. Let's talk about the authors, because once you understand who wrote these accounts and when, the whole story starts to look different. Juvenal wrote his Satire 6 at least 50 years after Messalina's death. He was a professional satirist, a comedian essentially, but with a pen instead of a microphone. His entire shtick was, women are terrible, marriage is a trap. Messalina was the perfect example for his argument. She was dead, so she couldn't defend herself. Her memory had already been destroyed by official decree, and the more shocking he made her sound, the better his satire worked. His audience understood this. They weren't reading Juvenal thinking, this is exactly what happened. They were reading it thinking, this is a brilliantly exaggerated moral lesson about the dangers of female excess. The question isn't whether Juvenal's story is true. The question is, why did Romans find this story so useful? Pliny is more interesting because he's more restrained. He's not trying to entertain. He's making a scientific argument about human nature. But even Pliny is using Messalina as a rhetorical device, an extreme example to prove his point about human insatiability. He writes in the context of comparing humans to animals, arguing that animals know when to stop, but humans don't. Messalina is his evidence. But the most important author is the one who doesn't talk about sex at all: Tacitus. Tacitus, writing in the Annals, gives us a completely different Messalina. His Messalina isn't driven by lust. She's driven by political terror. He describes her executing rivals, senators, wealthy aristocrats, anyone who posed a threat. He describes her forcing other women into adultery to blackmail their families. He describes her as ruthless, calculating, desperate. And here's what's crucial. Tacitus admits his sources. In the Annals, Book 13, he mentions that one of his primary sources for the Claudian period was the memoirs of Agrippina the Younger, the woman who replaced Messalina as Claudius's wife just 2 months after Messalina's execution. Think about that. Agrippina had every reason to make Messalina look as bad as possible. If Messalina was a monster, then Agrippina was an improvement. If Messalina was sexually depraved, then Agrippina's masculine despotism, as Tacitus calls it, seemed almost virtuous by comparison. This is the problem with all our sources. They're not neutral. They're not just recording what happened. They're constructing a narrative, sometimes decades after the fact, for specific political and rhetorical purposes. And that narrative tells us as much about the Romans who created it as it does about Messalina herself. The prostitute story served a purpose. It reduced a politically powerful woman to her sexuality. It made her easier to understand, easier to condemn, easier to use as a moral lesson. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. If Messalina was just a sex-addicted woman who couldn't control herself, then her destruction makes sense. But if she was a desperate mother trying to secure her son's future in a system where women had no formal power, well, that's a much more complicated story. And complicated stories don't make good propaganda. So let's talk about what Messalina actually did. The things that are documented by multiple sources, the things that got her killed. Because once you see the political reality, the sexual scandal starts to look less like the main story and more like the cover story. Between 41 and 48 AD, while Claudius was emperor and Messalina was empress, Rome saw a wave of political executions. Wealthy senators were accused of conspiracy and forced to commit suicide. Their estates were seized, their families were destroyed. And according to Tacitus, Messalina was often behind these prosecutions. Why? Modern historians like Barbara Levick have argued that Messalina was terrified. She had a son, Britannicus, who was supposed to inherit the empire. But Claudius was in his 60s and in poor health. If he died before Britannicus came of age, her son would be vulnerable. Other claimants could emerge. The Praetorian Guard could choose someone else. Everything could be lost. So Messalina did what powerful people in Rome did when they felt threatened. She eliminated rivals. She built alliances. And yes, she took lovers, but not random lovers. Her lovers were men with political power, men who could protect her, men who could support Britannicus if Claudius died. The most important of these lovers was Gaius Silius. According to Tacitus, Silius was consul designate for 49 AD, one of the highest political offices in Rome. He was young, handsome, and ambitious. And in the autumn of 48 AD, while Claudius was away at Ostia supervising harbour construction, something extraordinary happened. Messalina married Silius, not in secret, in public, with witnesses, with the full Roman wedding ceremony, the veil, the contract, the religious rites, while her husband, the emperor, was still alive and still very much her legal husband. This is what destroyed her. Not the prostitution, the marriage. Because here's what Romans understood immediately. In Rome, marriage wasn't about love. It was about law, about property, about political alliances. A woman couldn't have two husbands. So by marrying Silius, Messalina was declaring that Claudius was no longer her husband. She was making a public statement that the emperor's marriage was void. Tacitus himself expresses astonishment at this. He writes, "I am well aware that it will seem incredible that, in a city as watchful as Rome, anyone could have felt so safe." This is a historian who documented every kind of excess, every kind of scandal. And what shocks him isn't sex, it's the wedding. Because a wedding between Messalina and Silius wasn't adultery. It was treason. It was a coup attempt. If Claudius accepted this marriage as legal, he'd lose the throne. If he didn't act immediately, Silius, as consul designate and Messalina's husband, could claim authority over the imperial house. This was an existential threat to the regime. The emperor's freedmen, particularly Narcissus, who managed Claudius's correspondence, understood this immediately. They moved fast. While Claudius was still at Ostia, they brought him news of the marriage. According to Tacitus, Claudius remained strangely silent and then asked a single question: "Am I still master of the empire?" Not, "Why did my wife betray me?" Not, "How could she do this?" The question was about power, because that's what this was really about. Power, succession, the stability of the imperial system. Narcissus orchestrated the response. He knew that if Messalina got to Claudius in person, Claudius would forgive her. He'd always forgiven her before. So Narcissus made sure that didn't happen. He had Messalina trapped in the gardens of Lucullus, gardens that she'd stolen from a senator she'd had executed. And he sent soldiers. Messalina tried to write a letter to Claudius. Her mother Lepida was with her, urging her to take her own life honorably rather than wait for the executioner. But Messalina couldn't do it. According to Tacitus, she couldn't find the courage, so a tribune ran her through with a sword. When Claudius was told of her death, he showed no emotion. He asked for another cup of wine, and the next day, the Senate decreed damnatio memoriae, the complete erasure of Messalina from Roman history. Her statues were torn down, her images were defaced, her name was chiseled off monuments. Legally, officially, she ceased to have ever existed. 2 months later, Claudius married Agrippina the Younger, his niece, the mother of Nero, the woman whose memoirs would become one of Tacitus's primary sources for the story of Messalina. And suddenly, the narrative makes sense. Messalina had to be a monster, because if she wasn't, if she was just a desperate woman trying to protect her son in a system that gave her no formal power, then her destruction looks less like justice and more like murder. And Agrippina's marriage to her uncle looks less like salvation and more like opportunism. So now we can answer the original question. What did Romans think when their empress became a prostitute? The answer is, it depends on which Romans you're asking. The Senate. The senatorial class was terrified, not of Messalina's sexuality. They'd seen worse from emperors like Caligula and Tiberius. They were terrified of her political power. Messalina had orchestrated the deaths of senators, the confiscation of estates, the destruction of entire families. When Tacitus writes about Messalina, he's writing from a senatorial perspective, and what dominates his account isn't sex, it's executions. The Senate saw Messalina as a threat to their already diminished authority, a reminder that under the imperial system, even the oldest patrician families could be destroyed by an angry empress. The imperial freedmen, men like Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus, former slaves who'd risen to become the emperor's most powerful advisors, saw something different. They saw chaos. The imperial system worked only if the succession was clear, if the emperor's authority was unquestioned. Messalina's marriage to Silius threatened that stability. Her execution wasn't personal, it was administrative. She was a problem that needed to be solved before it destroyed the empire. Their perspective is visible in how quickly and efficiently they acted, how carefully they controlled Claudius's reaction, how thoroughly they orchestrated the damnatio memoriae, the common people of Rome. This is the hardest perspective to document because common people didn't write histories. But we can infer from what we know of Roman popular culture. Romans loved scandal. They loved gossip about the powerful. The prostitute story would have circulated in the streets, in the baths, in the shops, not as outrage but as entertainment. The plebeians had little stake in aristocratic politics. What they cared about was whether they had bread and games. As long as the grain supply flowed and the circus ran, they could enjoy the spectacle of an empress brought low without losing any sleep over it. The Stoic philosophers, men like Seneca, who was exiled during Messalina's reign and returned only after her death, saw Messalina as a moral lesson. The Stoics taught self-control, the mastery of desires, the importance of virtus over passion. A woman dominated by sexual appetite was, to Stoic thinking, someone who'd lost their humanity. The Latin word the Romans used for this wasn't nymphomania. That's a 19th century invention. The word was furor, fury, a state where desire overcomes reason. When Romans described Messalina with furor, they were saying she'd become something less than human, something closer to an animal driven only by instinct. Aristocratic Roman women. This perspective rarely makes it into the histories because Roman historians were men writing for male audiences. But the women of the aristocracy had the most to lose from Messalina's example. In Rome, a woman's sexual reputation determined her entire family's status. The concept of pudicitia, female sexual modesty, was foundational to Roman social structure. If the empress could violate pudicitia with impunity, what did that mean for the strict rules governing every other Roman woman's behavior? According to Cassius Dio, Messalina forced other aristocratic women to commit adultery with men she chose, then used that as blackmail. If true, this would have created absolute terror among Rome's elite women, not because of the sex itself, but because it put their families' reputations in Messalina's hands. And finally, Agrippina the Younger. The woman who replaced Messalina had the most to gain from making her predecessor look as terrible as possible. Agrippina's memoirs, used by Tacitus as a source, had a clear agenda. And it's notable that after all the stories about Messalina's sexual excess, Tacitus describes Agrippina by saying she did not, like Messalina, insult Rome by loose manners. The comparison was deliberate. Messalina had to be the worst so that Agrippina could seem better. This is how political narratives work in Rome. The destroyed are used to justify their destroyers. What's fascinating is that all these perspectives existed simultaneously. The Senate saw a political threat. The freedmen saw administrative chaos. The common people saw entertainment. The Stoics saw moral failure. The aristocratic women saw terror. And Agrippina saw opportunity. They were all looking at the same woman, but they were seeing completely different things. Now we can address the elephant in the room. Did Messalina actually work as a prostitute? Did the competition with 25 men in one night actually happen? Here's the honest answer. We don't know. And more importantly, from a Roman perspective, it might not have mattered whether it was literally true. The story served a purpose. It did something that Roman society needed. It took a politically powerful, dangerous woman and reduced her to her sexuality. It made her comprehensible, containable, condemnable. Because here's what Romans understood that we often miss. In Rome, sexual transgression by a woman wasn't just personal morality. It was political threat. The Romans had a concept that modern people struggle with. They didn't categorize sexuality as heterosexual or homosexual the way we do. They categorized it as active or passive, penetrator or penetrated. A Roman man could have sex with other men, with women, with slaves of any gender. As long as he was the active partner, his masculinity was intact. But to be penetrated was to be feminized, to be degraded. For women, the system was even more rigid. A Roman woman's entire social identity depended on her sexual status. A matrona, a respectable married woman, had legal protections, social respect, family honor. A meretrix, a prostitute, had none of those things. She was infama, socially dead, legally vulnerable. An empress was the highest possible matrona, the most protected, the most honored, the pinnacle of Roman feminine respectability. For an empress to become a prostitute, to voluntarily descend from the highest social position to the lowest, wasn't just shocking. It was a category violation that threatened the entire social order. This is what Juvenal understood when he coined the phrase meretrix Augusta, the imperial whore. It's an oxymoron. These two words should never exist together. An empress who is a prostitute is a logical impossibility, a tear in the fabric of Roman society. So when Juvenal wrote about Messalina in the brothel, he wasn't necessarily reporting fact. He was expressing a deeper Roman anxiety. What happens when the people at the top of the social hierarchy voluntarily abandon their position? What happens when an empress chooses degradation? What does that say about Roman values, Roman power, the whole Roman system? The prostitute story answered a Roman need to make sense of Messalina's destruction. It created a narrative where her execution wasn't political murder, it was moral necessity. She hadn't been destroyed because she threatened the Senate, or because she challenged the freedmen's power, or because Agrippina wanted to replace her. No, she'd been destroyed because she was consumed by furor, by an animal lust that made her less than human. That narrative was useful. So useful that it survived for 2,000 years, while the political complexity, the desperate mother trying to protect her son, the woman with no formal power trying to build informal alliances, the victim of a coup orchestrated by imperial freedmen, that complexity got buried under stories of sexual excess. And that tells us something profound about how societies deal with powerful women who fail. We sexualize them. We reduce them to their bodies. We make them about desire instead of power. Because desire we understand, desire we can condemn. But power is complicated. So here's what we've learned. What did Romans really think when their empress beat a prostitute in a sexual competition? The answer is, they thought many different things, all at once, often contradictory. Some Romans believed the story literally and condemned her moral failure. Some Romans knew the story was exaggerated, but enjoyed it as scandalous entertainment. Some Romans focused on her political crimes and barely cared about the sexual allegations. Some Romans saw a woman destroyed by her enemies and felt uncomfortable about the whole thing. But what every Roman understood, what they all saw reflected in Messalina's story, was a truth about their own civilization. Rome had created a system where women could have enormous informal power, but no formal authority. Where an empress could influence who lived and died, but couldn't hold office or command armies. Where a mother's only path to protecting her son was through the men she could seduce, manipulate, or marry. The Romans also understood something about spectacle and terror. They knew that the crowd in the Colosseum cheering for gladiatorial combat and the Senate ordering the damnatio memoriae of an empress were two sides of the same coin. Roman civilization ran on public violence, public humiliation, public destruction. Messalina's execution in the gardens of Lucullus wasn't hidden, it was theatrical. Her erasure from history wasn't quiet, it was a statement. And perhaps most tellingly, Romans understood that truth was less important than narrative. Whether Messalina actually competed against a prostitute mattered less than what Romans wanted to believe about her. The story served their needs, their need to explain why an empress was executed, their need to warn other women about the boundaries of acceptable behavior, their need to process the violence and instability of imperial succession. On that day in 48 AD, when soldiers found Messalina in the gardens, when she couldn't find the courage to take her own life, and a tribune's sword ended her at age 28, Romans didn't see a tragedy. They saw a cautionary tale. They saw confirmation of everything they already believed about female desire, about political chaos, about the necessity of harsh punishment. They saw what they needed to see. And 2,000 years later, we're still telling her story, still asking what really happened, still trying to separate fact from propaganda, truth from moral lesson, the woman from the myth. Maybe that's the real answer. What did Romans think of Messalina? They thought what every society thinks when a powerful woman falls. They thought she deserved it. They thought she brought it on herself. They thought her destruction was proof that the system worked, that order had been restored, that the world made sense again. And then, just like we do now, they moved on to the next scandal, the next spectacle, the next story that would help them make sense of the violent, glittering, ruthless civilization they'd created. The gardens of Lucullus, where Messalina died, still exist, buried under modern Rome. Her son Britannicus was poisoned by Nero 5 years later. Her daughter Octavia married Nero and was executed at 22. The dynasty she tried to protect didn't survive a generation, but the story of the Empress who became a prostitute, that story survived, because Rome needed it to survive. And perhaps that's the most Roman thing of all.